Picture this. Sarah Mitchell from Dallas, Texas thought she'd found her soulmate. A handsome man named Ryan who sent her flowers, called her every night, and promised her the romantic cruise of her dreams. She packed her best dresses, told her friends about this amazing guy she'd met online, and boarded that luxury cruise ship with stars in her eyes and love in her heart. What she didn't know was that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that would turn her dream vacation into the fight of her life. This wasn't just a romance scam. This was something far worse. A trafficking operation that used the isolation of the open ocean to prey on vulnerable women who thought they'd found love. Sarah's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about survival against impossible odds and the courage it takes to escape when the entire world around you becomes your prison. By the end of this story, you'll never look at online dating or cruise ships the same way again. Stay with me, because what happened to Sarah could happen to anyone, and her escape is nothing short of miraculous. Before we continue deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Mitchell was 32 years old and tired of being alone. After a painful divorce 2 years earlier, she'd thrown herself into her work as a pediatric nurse at Dallas Children's Hospital, but the long shifts and emotional demands of caring for sick children left her feeling drained and isolated. Her small apartment in the Oak Cliff neighborhood felt more like a prison than a home, especially on weekends when she'd scroll through social media, watching her friends post pictures of romantic dinners and couples' vacations. The smell of coffee from the shop downstairs would drift through her windows each morning, reminding her of the breakfast dates she no longer had, the simple moments of connection that seemed so far out of reach. It was on a particularly lonely Thursday evening in February when Sarah decided to try online dating again. She'd deleted her profiles months earlier after a series of disappointing dates, but desperation and hope made her create a new account on Elite Singles. She chose her best photo, the one from her cousin's wedding where her smile looked genuine and her dark hair caught the light perfectly. In her profile, she was honest about wanting something real, something lasting. She wrote about her love of travel, her dream of seeing the Caribbean, her hope of finding someone who valued kindness over appearance and conversation over games. Ryan Matthews seemed too good to be true from the moment his first message appeared in her inbox. His profile showed a tall, athletic man with kind eyes and a warm smile, claiming to be a successful import-export businessman who travelled frequently but was ready to settle down. His messages weren't like the usual one-liners she received. Ryan asked thoughtful questions about her work, remembered details from previous conversations, and shared stories about his own life that made him seem vulnerable and real. He told her about losing his mother to cancer, about feeling disconnected from his work despite his financial success, about longing for someone who understood that money couldn't buy happiness. Their first phone call lasted 3 hours. Sarah found herself curled up on her couch, forgetting about the crime drama she'd been watching as Ryan's deep voice filled her apartment with stories and laughter. He had this way of making her feel like the most interesting person in the world, asking follow-up questions about her patients, genuinely caring about the challenges she faced at work. When she mentioned her dream of taking a Caribbean cruise, Ryan's voice became animated with excitement. He told her about the luxury ship he'd travelled on the previous year, describing sunset dinners and dancing under the stars in ways that made her heart race with possibility. The gifts started arriving within 2 weeks of their first conversation. Not expensive items that would make her uncomfortable, but thoughtful tokens that showed he was listening. A small potted orchid for her apartment because she'd mentioned loving flowers, but never buying them for herself. A book of Caribbean travel photography because she'd talked about dreaming of turquoise waters. A playlist he'd created of songs that reminded him of their conversations, delivered through Spotify with a note that said he hoped she'd think of him when she heard them. Each gesture felt perfectly calibrated to her personality, her desires, her vulnerabilities. Ryan's business trips provided convenient explanations for their inability to meet in person. He was always just about to return to Dallas when something urgent would come up, requiring him to extend his stay in Miami, or Los Angeles, or New York. But he made up for the distance with constant communication. Good morning texts that arrived precisely when her alarm went off, voice messages sent during his supposed lunch breaks, late-night calls that lasted until she fell asleep, with the phone still pressed to her ear. He painted pictures of their future together with such vivid detail that Sarah began to believe in possibilities she'd thought were reserved for other people. After 2 months of this careful courtship, Ryan made his proposal. His company was sponsoring a luxury cruise departing from Miami, and he had the opportunity to bring a guest. He'd been saving this invitation for someone special, he explained, someone who would appreciate not just the beautiful destinations, but the chance to spend uninterrupted time together away from the distractions of work and daily life. The cruise would visit 3 Caribbean islands over 7 days, with stops in Jamaica, Barbados, and the Virgin Islands. He described the ship's amenities in loving detail: the spa where she could finally relax, the multiple restaurants where they could try cuisines from around the world, the private balcony where they could watch the sunset, paint the ocean in colours she'd only seen in movies. Sarah's practical side raised obvious concerns. Meeting someone for the first time on a cruise ship, being trapped in the middle of the ocean with a man she'd never seen face to face, seemed like the plot of a thriller movie where nothing good ever happened to the naive protagonist. But Ryan addressed each worry with patient understanding and logical solutions. The ship would be full of other passengers and crew members, making it one of the safest possible environments for a first meeting. If she felt uncomfortable at any point, she could simply retreat to her own cabin, which he would book separately to respect her boundaries. He even offered to pay for a refundable airline ticket so she could change her mind right up until the day of departure without losing any money. More importantly, Ryan seemed to understand her hesitation in ways that made her feel seen and protected rather than pressured. He told her about his own nervousness, his fear that she might not find him as attractive in person as she did in photos, his worry that he'd built up this moment so much in his mind that reality couldn't possibly live up to it. His vulnerability made her want to comfort him, to prove that her feelings were based on more than physical attraction, that the connection they'd built through hours of conversation was real and lasting. How would you feel if someone seemed to understand your deepest desires and fears with such precision? When you've been lonely for so long, wouldn't it be natural to want to believe that someone could see past your defenses to the person you really are inside? The Royal Caribbean cruise ship Majesty of the Seas gleamed white against the blue Miami sky as Sarah stood on the dock, her heart pounding with excitement and terror in equal measure. The ship was even more impressive than the photos Ryan had shared, rising 12 stories above the water with balconies and windows creating patterns of light and shadow along its massive hull. The sound of steel drums drifted from the boarding area, mixing with the chatter of excited passengers and the mechanical hum of luggage carts rolling across concrete. Sarah clutched her boarding pass and tried to calm her breathing as she scanned the crowd for Ryan's familiar face. When she spotted him near the priority boarding line, her relief was immediate and overwhelming. He looked exactly like his photos, maybe even more handsome in person, with sun-streaked brown hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he belonged in places like this. Ryan's smile when he saw her was everything she'd hoped for, wide and genuine and full of the same warmth she'd heard in his voice during their countless phone calls. He moved through the crowd with purpose, wrapping her in a hug that smelled of expensive cologne and felt like the answer to months of anticipation. The boarding process felt like entering another world. Ryan had arranged for priority check-in, which meant they skipped the long lines of families with screaming children and elderly couples struggling with oversized suitcases. Their cabin assignments were on the 9th floor, with Ryan's suite just 3 doors down from Sarah's interior room. He'd kept his promise about separate accommodations, but as they rode the elevator together, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, Sarah found herself hoping those separate rooms might prove unnecessary. Sarah's cabin was small but perfectly appointed, with a narrow bed covered in crisp white linens and a tiny desk where she could place her phone charger and the romance novel she'd brought for afternoon reading by the pool. The bathroom was barely large enough for one person, But it had all the essentials, and the mirror was framed with bulbs that made her skin look healthier than it had in months. She unpacked quickly, hanging her 3 sundresses and 1 formal gown in the narrow closet, arranging her toiletries on the limited counter space, and placing the framed photo of her and her sister on the desk for good luck. Ryan's suite, which he showed her during the safety briefing, was everything her room wasn't. A king-sized bed dominated the main area, with sliding glass doors opening onto a private balcony that offered unobstructed views of the ocean. The sitting area had a leather couch and coffee table where room service could be arranged for private meals, and the bathroom featured a jetted tub that Sarah imagined would be perfect for relaxing after days spent exploring tropical islands. But what impressed her most was how Ryan had personalized the space in the few hours since boarding. Fresh flowers sat on the coffee table, and he'd arranged several framed photos of them together on the dresser, pictures she didn't remember taking or sending him. Their first evening together exceeded every expectation Sarah had built up over months of long-distance courtship. Ryan had made reservations at the ship's most exclusive restaurant, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic views of the Miami coastline as they pulled away from shore. The menu featured dishes Sarah had never heard of, prepared by chefs who'd trained at restaurants she'd only read about in magazines. Ryan ordered wine that cost more than she typically spent on groceries in a month, but his easy confidence made her feel sophisticated rather than out of place. The conversation flowed as naturally as it had during their phone calls, maybe even better now that they could see each other's expressions and gestures. Ryan was an attentive listener, asking follow-up questions about her work and making her laugh with stories about his business travels. He had this way of making her feel like the only person in the restaurant, despite being surrounded by hundreds of other passengers. When she mentioned being nervous about dancing later, he took her hand across the table and promised to lead her through every step, making even her clumsiness look graceful. After dinner, they explored the ship's entertainment areas, which seemed designed to transport passengers to different worlds within the confines of the floating city. The casino was all gold and red velvet, filled with the electronic sounds of slot machines and the quiet intensity of card players focused on their hands. The theatre featured a Broadway-style show that Sarah watched with the same wide-eyed wonder she'd had as a child at her first circus. The nightclub pulsed with music and coloured lights, creating an atmosphere of celebration that made everyone seem more attractive and confident than they probably were in daylight. But it was the quiet moments between activities that felt most significant to Sarah. Walking along the ship's promenade deck, feeling the warm ocean breeze and watching the wake create patterns in the dark water behind them. Standing on Ryan's balcony after midnight, sharing a bottle of champagne and talking about their hopes for the week ahead. The way he kissed her for the first time, gentle and patient, asking permission with his eyes before his lips touched hers. Everything felt like scenes from a romantic movie, too perfect to be real but happening to her nonetheless. The first signs that something wasn't quite right were so subtle that Sarah dismissed them as her own insecurity rather than legitimate concerns. During dinner, she noticed Ryan checking his phone frequently, his brow furrowing as he read messages he didn't share with her. When she asked about it, he explained that his business partners were dealing with a time-sensitive deal, nothing that would interfere with their vacation, but requiring his occasional attention to keep things moving smoothly. His explanation made perfect sense, and Sarah felt foolish for even questioning it. Later, while they were dancing in the nightclub, Sarah saw Ryan talking quietly with a man she didn't recognize, their conversation intense enough that Ryan's body language changed noticeably. The man was older, probably in his 50s, with greying hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested serious money. When Sarah asked who he was, Ryan casually mentioned meeting him in the elevator earlier, just making friendly conversation with another passenger. But something about the interaction felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, though Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered her about it. The most unsettling moment came when they were back in Ryan's suite, sharing champagne and talking about their plans for Jamaica the next day. Sarah had excused herself to use the bathroom, and when she returned, Ryan was standing on the balcony with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. She caught fragments of the conversation that didn't sound like business. something about timing, about everything being arranged, about someone named Maria who was expecting them. When Ryan noticed her listening, he ended the call abruptly and explained that his assistant was confirming their shore excursion arrangements, making sure they had priority access to the best beaches and restaurants. Each explanation Ryan offered was perfectly reasonable, but together they created a pattern that nagged at Sarah's subconscious, even as her conscious mind accepted his words. She found herself studying his face during these moments, looking for tells she wouldn't have noticed during phone conversations. The way his left eye twitched slightly when he was improvising details. The way his voice became more formal when he was repeating information rather than speaking spontaneously. The way his hand moved to his pocket whenever his phone buzzed, as if he were fighting the urge to check it immediately. But these concerns were overwhelmed by the romance of their situation, and Sarah's desperate desire to believe that her loneliness was finally ending. The ocean views from Ryan's balcony were more beautiful than any photograph could capture, painted in colours that changed with each hour of the day. The feeling of being cared for, of having someone anticipate her needs and wants, was intoxicating after months of taking care of everyone else. And the physical attraction between them felt natural and mutual, building slowly through shared glances and casual touches that promised more intimate connection to come. What would you do if you noticed small inconsistencies in someone's story, but everything else about your time with them felt like a fairy tale coming true? Would you trust your instincts, or would you let yourself believe in the possibility that good things could actually happen to you? The morning of their third day at sea, Sarah woke up alone in Ryan's suite, sunshine streaming through the balcony doors and the smell of ocean air filling the cabin. She could hear the distant sounds of passengers beginning their day, footsteps in the hallway and the clatter of room service carts delivering breakfast to other suites. Ryan's side of the bed was cold, suggesting he'd been gone for hours, and his absence felt strange after 2 nights of waking up in his arms. Sarah wrapped herself in the plush hotel robe and padded to the bathroom, assuming Ryan had gone for his usual morning run around the ship's jogging track. But when she checked the time, her confusion deepened. It was nearly 10 in the morning, much later than Ryan typically exercised, and they'd made plans to have breakfast together before their shore excursion in Jamaica. Sarah tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail with no explanation. She considered returning to her own cabin to shower and change, giving Ryan privacy to handle whatever business emergency might have called him away. But something about the situation felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. That's when she noticed details about the suite that hadn't registered in her previous visits. The framed photos Ryan had placed on the dresser weren't of them together, as she'd initially assumed, but of Ryan with other women in similar poses and locations. Different faces, different hair colours, but the same intimate positioning and tropical backgrounds that suggested other cruises, other romantic getaways. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined each photo more closely, recognising poses and expressions that mirrored her own recent experiences with Ryan. The knock on the suite door came while Sarah was still processing the implications of what she'd discovered. Expecting Ryan to return with some reasonable explanation for his absence and the disturbing photographs, Sarah opened the door without checking the peephole. Instead of Ryan's familiar face, she found herself staring at 2 men she'd never seen before, both wearing crew uniforms that looked authentic but somehow wrong, like costumes rather than actual ship employee attire. The older man, probably in his 50s with weathered skin and cold eyes, spoke first. His voice had an accent Sarah couldn't place, European maybe, or Eastern European. He told her that Ryan had been called away on urgent business, but had asked them to escort her to a special area of the ship where they could continue their vacation in private. The younger man, who couldn't have been much older than Sarah herself, remained silent, but positioned himself in a way that blocked her from closing the door. Sarah's instincts screamed danger, but her rational mind struggled to process what was happening. These men knew Ryan's name, knew she was staying in his suite, spoke as if they were part of some prearranged plan she simply hadn't been informed about. The older man's explanation about Ryan's business emergency echoed previous conversations where Ryan had mentioned the demanding nature of his work, the last-minute crises that required his immediate attention even during personal time. But when Sarah asked to call Ryan directly before going anywhere with strangers, the younger man's demeanor changed completely. He stepped into the suite without invitation, his presence suddenly menacing rather than merely official. The older man's voice lost its pretense of polite service as he explained that Ryan was no longer part of the equation, that Sarah now belonged to different people who had different plans for her vacation. The word belonged hit Sarah like a physical blow, its implications clear even as her mind rejected the possibility of what was happening. She tried to push past the men, to escape into the hallway where other passengers might see and intervene, but the younger man caught her arm with practiced efficiency. His grip was strong enough to leave bruises, and his casual expertise suggested this wasn't his first time restraining someone against their will. That's when Sarah understood with horrible clarity that Ryan had never been her boyfriend, never been her romantic salvation, never been anything more than bait in an elaborate trap. The months of careful courtship, the thoughtful gifts, the patient building of trust and intimacy had all been designed to get her onto this ship, isolated in the middle of the ocean where her disappearance could be explained as an accident or suicide. The photos on the dresser weren't mistakes or oversights. They were trophies, evidence of other women who'd been lured into similar situations with similar romantic fantasies. The older man, who introduced himself only as Victor, explained the situation with the kind of matter-of-fact cruelty that suggested he'd delivered similar news many times before. Sarah was now the property of an organization that specialized in providing exotic services to wealthy clients who preferred their entertainment to be both beautiful and unwilling. The cruise ship setting wasn't accidental, he explained, because the isolation of international waters made certain activities possible that would be much riskier on land. Sarah's mind reeled as Victor described what her new life would entail, his words painting a picture so horrific that she initially refused to believe it was real. Surely this was some kind of elaborate prank, some misunderstanding that would be cleared up when Ryan returned with explanations and apologies. But the clinical way Victor discussed her future, the specific details about clients and expectations, made it impossible to maintain her denial. The most devastating realization came when Victor showed her Ryan's real identification, a passport with a completely different name and nationality. The man she'd fallen in love with, the person she'd trusted with her safety and her heart, didn't exist. Even his accent, which she'd found so charming during their phone calls, had been carefully constructed to match whatever persona he thought would be most appealing to a lonely nurse from Dallas. Sarah's attempts to negotiate, to offer money or promises or anything that might secure her release were met with amused indifference. Victor explained that her value wasn't monetary in any traditional sense, that the clients who would be paying for her services were interested in experiences that couldn't be purchased from willing participants. The fact that she was educated, articulate, and obviously from a respectable background only increased her appeal to certain types of buyers. When Sarah tried to scream, the younger man produced a small device that he pressed against her neck, delivering an electric shock that left her temporarily paralyzed and voiceless. The pain was unlike anything she'd experienced, sharp and overwhelming. But worse was the realization that these men had tools and techniques specifically designed for controlling unwilling victims. This wasn't random violence or crime of opportunity. It was a professional operation with systems and procedures refined through repetition. As Victor prepared to inject her with something he described as a mild sedative that would make their journey through the ship less complicated, Sarah's mind raced through possibilities for escape or rescue. But the reality of her situation became increasingly clear with each passing moment. She was in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by thousands of passengers who had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong, trapped with professional criminals who had obviously planned every detail of her abduction. The last thing Sarah remembered before the sedative took effect was Victor's voice explaining that her disappearance would be reported as a tragic accident, a woman who'd gotten too close to the ship's railing during a romantic evening and fallen overboard, despite her companion's heroic attempts to save her. Her body would never be recovered, of course, because the ocean was vast and unpredictable, but the official investigation would conclude that she'd simply been another victim of the dangers inherent in cruise ship travel. How would you feel if you discovered that months of what seemed like genuine connection had been nothing more than professional manipulation designed to put you in danger? Can you imagine the terror of realizing that your dream vacation had become your worst nightmare, and that no one even knew you were in danger? Sarah regained consciousness in what appeared to be a storage area deep in the bowels of the ship, far from the luxurious passenger decks where vacationers were probably enjoying afternoon activities around the pool. The air smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and engine oil, and the constant vibration of the ship's machinery created a low humming that seemed to penetrate her bones. Her head throbbed from whatever drug Victor had injected, and her mouth felt cotton dry. But worse than the physical discomfort was the crushing realization that the nightmare she'd hoped was a hallucination was devastatingly real. The room where they'd imprisoned her was clearly designed for human cargo rather than legitimate storage. Heavy-duty locks secured the door from the outside, and the walls had been reinforced with additional metal plating that would muffle any sounds she might make. A single dim bulb provided barely enough light to see the basic amenities that had been installed for previous occupants: a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a chemical toilet behind a flimsy privacy screen, and a small sink that delivered lukewarm water in sporadic bursts. But Sarah wasn't alone in her prison. Huddled on a similar cot across the small space was another woman, probably in her mid-20s, with long black hair and the kind of exotic features that suggested mixed ethnicity. The woman's clothes, which had probably been elegant when she first put them on, were now wrinkled and stained, and her eyes held the flat, defeated expression of someone who'd been trapped much longer than Sarah had. The woman introduced herself as Maria, and her story provided horrific context for Sarah's own situation. Maria had been captured 3 weeks earlier during what she'd thought was a romantic getaway to the Bahamas with a man she'd met through a dating app. Her captor, like Ryan, had been charming and patient, building trust over months of communication before suggesting the trip that would become her undoing. But unlike Sarah, Maria had been moved between multiple ships and locations, serving the twisted desires of clients who paid premium prices for access to unwilling victims. Maria's matter-of-fact description of her experiences over the past 3 weeks painted a picture so horrific that Sarah initially couldn't process the full implications. The trafficking operation that had ensnared them both was sophisticated and international, with connections to criminal organizations that specialized in different aspects of the trade. Some groups focused on recruitment and capture, others on transportation and logistics, still others on client services and security. The cruise ship environment was particularly attractive to this network because it provided isolation, mobility, and a legitimate cover for moving people between international jurisdictions. According to Maria, their captors rotated prisoners between different ships and locations to prevent them from becoming too familiar with any particular environment or routine. The women were also moved frequently to serve different types of clients, from wealthy individuals who could afford private access to larger groups who were willing to pay less for shared experiences. The variety of situations kept victims off balance and hopeless, unable to develop escape plans or build relationships with potential allies. But what struck Sarah most about Maria's account wasn't the brutality of their captors, though that was certainly evident, but the calculated psychology of the operation. The traffickers had studied their victims carefully, understanding exactly which emotional vulnerabilities to exploit and which promises would be most effective in maintaining control. They used a combination of physical threats, psychological manipulation, and false hope to keep their prisoners compliant, offering small privileges or temporary reprieve to women who cooperated while making examples of those who resisted. Maria described watching other prisoners come and go over the weeks, some disappearing entirely, while others returned with new injuries and deeper despair. The most disturbing aspect of her account was the way the operation normalized violence and degradation, treating human suffering as just another business expense to be managed efficiently. The crew members who brought food and handled security spoke about their prisoners like livestock, discussing their condition and usefulness with the same casual indifference they might show toward any other cargo. Despite the horror of Maria's experiences, Sarah was struck by the other woman's resilience and intelligence. Maria had been observing their captors carefully, noting their routines and procedures, identifying potential weaknesses in the security arrangements. She'd also been gathering information about the ship's layout, from conversations she'd overheard and details she'd noticed during her movements between different areas of the vessel. Most importantly, Maria had maintained hope that escape was possible, though she acknowledged the enormous challenges they faced. The ship was enormous and maze-like, with passenger areas completely separated from the industrial sections where they were being held. The crew members involved in the trafficking operation were professionals who'd obviously dealt with escape attempts before, and they had backup plans and security measures designed to prevent exactly the kind of rescue Maria and Sarah were contemplating. But Maria had also identified potential opportunities that might be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and timing. The ship made regular stops at various ports, creating brief windows when security might be focused on other priorities. There were also shift changes in the crew that left certain areas temporarily undermanned and emergency procedures that might be triggered to create confusion and distraction. The most promising element of Maria's analysis involved the legitimate ship employees who weren't part of the trafficking operation. Most of the crew members were honest people just doing their jobs, and some of them might be willing to help if they understood what was happening. The challenge was distinguishing between potential allies and criminal conspirators without exposing themselves to additional danger. Sarah's medical training provided a different perspective on their situation that complemented Maria's observations about security and logistics. As a nurse, Sarah understood human physiology and psychology in ways that might be useful for both survival and escape. She knew how to assess and treat injuries, how to recognize signs of drug influence, and how to identify medical emergencies that might require immediate attention from ship personnel. More importantly, Sarah's professional experience had taught her how to remain calm and functional during crisis situations, skills that were proving invaluable in their current circumstances. While Maria had the advantage of weeks to study their captors and environment, Sarah brought fresh energy and perspective to their analysis of escape possibilities. Together, the two women began developing a plan that combined Maria's knowledge of the ship and security procedures with Sarah's medical expertise and problem-solving skills. Their approach focused on creating opportunities rather than simply reacting to circumstances, identifying ways to manipulate their captors' routines and expectations to create windows for escape. The plan they developed was necessarily complex and risky, requiring precise timing and considerable luck to succeed. But both women understood that their situation would only worsen with time, that their value to the trafficking operation would decrease as they became more psychologically damaged and physically deteriorated. If they were going to escape, it would have to be soon, before they were moved to another location or sold to clients who might make rescue impossible. The most difficult aspect of their planning involved accepting the possibility that only one of them might be able to escape, and that whoever remained behind would face severe retribution from their captors. Neither woman was willing to abandon the other, but they also recognized that a failed escape attempt would likely result in punishment that would eliminate any future opportunities for freedom. As they refined their plan over the course of several days, Sarah found herself drawing on reserves of courage and determination she hadn't known she possessed. The naive romantic who'd boarded this ship with dreams of finding love had been replaced by someone harder and more focused, someone who understood that survival required difficult choices and calculated risks. How would you maintain hope and determination in such a desperate situation? Do you think you could find the strength to fight for your freedom even when the odds seemed impossible? The opportunity Sarah and Maria had been waiting for came during their second week of captivity, when the ship docked in Barbados for what was supposed to be a routine passenger excursion day. The port, bustling with activity, created the perfect cover for their desperate escape attempt, with legitimate crew members focused on managing thousands of passengers leaving and returning to the ship throughout the day. The trafficking operation's security was necessarily reduced during port calls, as too many guards in passenger areas would attract unwanted attention from local authorities and cruise line officials. Sarah's plan relied on her medical knowledge and Maria's observations about their captors' routines. She'd been secretly saving the antidepressant medication from her purse, crushing the pills and mixing them with water to create a concentrated solution that would cause severe drowsiness when consumed. The dosage was carefully calculated to incapacitate without causing permanent harm, though Sarah acknowledged that her improvised chemistry was far from precise. During the guards' regular food delivery, Maria created a distraction while Sarah doctored their captor's coffee with the dissolved medication. The guard, a heavy-set man in his 40s who'd been particularly cruel during their imprisonment, began showing signs of drug influence within 30 minutes of drinking the spiked coffee. His speech became slurred, his coordination deteriorated, and his usual alertness gave way to increasing confusion and lethargy. When he finally collapsed into unconsciousness, Sarah and Maria had perhaps 2 hours before the next security check, maybe less if someone noticed his absence earlier than expected. Getting out of their improvised prison required tools they'd been secretly collecting over days of careful observation. Maria had noticed that one of the wall panels was secured with screws that had been loosened by the ship's constant vibration, and Sarah had managed to fashion a makeshift screwdriver from a piece of metal broken off from the cot frame. Working together, they removed the panel to reveal access to the ship's maintenance tunnels, a network of passages designed for crew members to service electrical and plumbing systems throughout the vessel. The maintenance tunnels were claustrophobic and disorienting, filled with pipes and cables that created obstacles in the dim emergency lighting. Sarah's childhood fear of confined spaces made the journey a psychological nightmare, but her determination to escape overrode her phobias. Maria led the way through passages she'd memorized from overheard conversations, navigating by feel and instinct toward what they hoped would be access to the passenger decks. The most terrifying moment of their escape came when they encountered another crew member in the tunnels, a young man who seemed as surprised to see them as they were to see him. Sarah's heart stopped as she prepared for capture and punishment, but the crew member's reaction suggested he wasn't part of the trafficking operation. He seemed confused rather than threatening, asking in broken English if they were lost passengers who'd wandered into a restricted area. Maria's quick thinking saved them from exposure. She explained that they were crew members from the laundry service, returning to their quarters after completing duties in the passenger areas. Her confident delivery and knowledge of ship terminology convinced the man to give them directions to what he thought was their destination, actually providing information that helped them navigate toward the main passenger decks. Emerging from the maintenance tunnels into the cruise ship's opulent passenger areas felt like stepping into another world entirely. The contrast between their dark, mechanical prison and the luxurious surroundings where vacationers enjoyed their dream getaways was stark and surreal. Sarah had to resist the urge to approach random passengers and beg for help, knowing that their disheveled appearance and desperate story would likely be dismissed as the ravings of mentally ill individuals or drug addicts. Instead, they implemented the final phase of their escape plan, which involved reaching the ship's medical facility, where Sarah hoped her professional credentials might provide credibility with the staff. The ship's doctor, a middle-aged woman from the Philippines, initially seemed skeptical of their claims about trafficking and imprisonment, but Sarah's detailed medical knowledge and ability to describe the ship's crew areas convinced the doctor that something serious was happening. The doctor's decision to contact the ship's security chief rather than local port authorities probably saved Sarah and Maria's lives.